Putin is driven not by what you or I would be driven by. He's driven by these dreams of rebuilding the Russian Empire, seeing himself in the pantheon alongside Catherine the Great and Peter the Great. And everything that was once Russian land should again be Russian land. And that Ukrainians are not a separate people. They're confused Russians. And so he is always going to go to the extreme. And that means that he will fail.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot. And this time we're joined by former US Ambassador to NATO, Kurt Volker. Ambassador Volker is a leading expert in US foreign and national security policy. He's a distinguished fellow at the Center for European Policy Analysis and was US Special Representative for Ukraine negotiations between 2017 and 2019. Kurt Volker, welcome back to Frontline. Good to see you again.
Thank you so much, Kate. Great to be with you.
So I really would like to get your perspective on something that's been in the news just today. We're talking on Thursday. Something may happen in the next 24 hours, who knows? But the Ukrainian president has accused Russia of trying to create the risk of nuclear incidents at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant and Zaporizhzhia. The latter cut off the electricity and relying on a generator for days after the external power was cut off. The former suffered a blackout, which Ukraine says was caused by Russian drone attacks on an energy facility nearby. What's your reading of the situation?
Well, several things. First off, this power plant, the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, has been cut off from the basic electricity supply several times before. So this has happened and it's been managed, but this is the longest period of time now that it has been separated from the main power supply and is on backup. So that introduces a risk, because if the backup fails, then you run the risk of a meltdown, as we've seen, tragedies at other nuclear power plants in the past. Second, this fits a pattern. Russia is in a very weak position right now. Economically, militarily, diplomatically, and politically. And we see this at the gasoline lines. We see this with inflation. We see this with their inability to make any meaningful gains on the battlefield. And so with all of that, Russia is doing things to escalate, to try to scare the West. The MiG incursion into Estonia, the drone incursion into Poland, same thing in Romania, the drone shutdown of the Copenhagen airport, this nuclear power plant saying, it's cut off from power and it's a real risk now. So they're trying to scare the West, to force the West to push Ukraine to surrender. I don't think that's going to happen. I don't think the West could even do it if they wanted to, which of course they don't. But it fits this pattern of Russia being in a weak position and so doing things to try to demonstrate strength and recklessness and resolve.
So there is no doubt in your mind that what is happening at these two nuclear power plants is linked, and it's all part of a dangerous escalation.
Well, it certainly is. Now, it could be that it was unintentional, that they knocked out the power again. It could be. But that being said, they are using it now to extend this power outage in a way to try to get people nervous.
So let's, from your personal perspective, I know you were in Ukraine recently and you were in Odessa when Russia launched that largest ever overnight attack with more than 800 missiles and drones. You'll be very familiar with the conditions in the Ukraine war, but what was that night like for you?
It was loud. I've been to Odessa and Kyiv and other places several times over the past few years. And so the nightly air raids are not something unusual. What was unusual that night was the number of attacks, the number of projectiles that were sent. It was a very large number. And you heard the air defenses, and you learned to differentiate the sounds between the incoming drone, kind of a low motor, the air defense systems of different types that go after them, and then the very loud explosions, which is when something hits the ground. And so we heard all of that a couple times throughout the night. Having lived through this several times, and the Ukrainians, of course, live through it every night, you know that the risks are pretty small, in the law of large numbers. It may hit somewhere, someone may get killed, and in that case they did that night in Odessa. But the chances of it affecting you are very, very small. And of course, for the most part, the Russians are targeting things that are not right in the heart of the downtown. For the most part, they're targeting things that they think have some relevance to Ukraine's military effort. But of course, they don't care what they hit and where the debris falls. And so there's always that effect of hitting civilians and killing civilians in the course of this. So it was a loud, long night. And the next day, Keith Kellogg arrived in Kyiv, and things quieted down for a couple of days.
They did, but then there were the drones that went into Poland, weren't there? The massive attacks on Kyiv. What do you think of the timing of that? Why now? What was their purpose?
Well, I do think it is a function of Putin being in a weak position and wanting to convey strength. So with Poland, they had this Zapad military exercise going on in Belarus. So the Russians and Belarusians were there. They had the usual air raids on Ukraine that night. And then from a separate location, they launched these drones going into Poland. Lasted about 6.5 to 7 hours. The Poles told me there was 21 total drones that entered Polish airspace. They were not able to shoot all of them down, but they did shoot some of them down. And what the most interesting thing about that whole episode is that all of the drones that entered Poland were unarmed, which to me is an indicator that it was intentional. Because if they were aiming at Ukraine, they would have been armed because they attack Ukraine. What they were doing here with unarmed drones was just testing to see what NATO and Poland would do.
And what NATO countries have done is launched Operation Eastern Sentry to defend NATO's eastern flank. Do you think that is enough?
No, I don't, to be honest. I think it's a good step. I'm certainly not complaining about enhanced readiness and enhanced multinationality in air defenses over NATO territory. But what we saw with both Poland and Romania is that Russia is willing to fly these dangerous objects into NATO airspace and putting NATO populations at risk. So we should be declaring an extended air defense zone around NATO territory with the cooperation of Ukraine to say we're not going to let them get that close. We're going to take things out, not waiting until they're inside NATO territory. If Russia is being that reckless as to send these dangerous flying objects that explode close to our borders, we should take them down before they enter our borders. So an extended air defense zone of 150 or 200 kilometers in collaboration with Ukraine, seamlessly integrating the air defense over that area, that would be important for the safety of NATO, and it would actually help Ukraine in protecting its own population in those areas as well.
So that extended air defense zone, that would be what in the west of Ukraine, would it?
I would say just draw a line out from the Polish borders, Romanian borders, Slovak borders, and say we can project air defense into that area to make sure nothing is entering NATO airspace. And I would tie it directly as a response to those reckless Russian use of drones inside NATO territory.
Of course, the Kremlin is going to argue that if NATO fires a shot over Ukraine, it's directly involved in the war against Russia.
Yeah, isn't that ironic that Russia feels perfectly comfortable firing missiles and drones and everything you can think of at Ukraine every day, and even flying some of them into NATO territory. And yet, if NATO were to defend itself, that would be an act of war.
What about doing that without US military backing? Can it be done?
It can be done. It's better if we all act together. And certainly the US has satellites and intelligence and targeting and a lot of the enabling capabilities that would be needed. No, there's no suggestion that any of that would be turned off or shut down with respect to NATO defending itself either. And in fact, you heard President Trump in New York last week when asked if NATO countries should shoot down Russian aircraft if they enter NATO airspace. He said, yes, they should. So I don't see any suggestion that these enablers will be turned off, and I think it would be the forces at the fringes or the frontiers of NATO territory that would be the ones in the lead.
There has been some discussion about different NATO allies being able to have different rules of engagement, I presume, on Operation Eastern Sentry as it stands. But if you have this extended air defence zone that you're talking about, what do you think? How would it actually operate? How do you see it working on a daily basis?
My view would be, first off, we make it a public declaration. We say we do not want things flying in that airspace, period. And we say that, communicate that to Russia. And if you do, we will work to take them out, and we'll do so in coordination with Ukraine because it'll be over their territory, but NATO will be protecting itself. Then you'll have to have a 24/7 operations center where we are monitoring the skies. And when there are attempts to get into that airspace, we react immediately. And we should be able to do this with Ukraine doing what it does every day, which is defend itself and defend its territory, but with some assistance from NATO. And I would say that assistance would take the form of air defense systems that are inside NATO territory but projecting forward. It could be air launch platforms as well. And it would be an enhancement of the intelligence and integration of an air defense picture. And I think with a little bit of engineering work, NATO could help Ukraine, or Ukraine could help NATO use some AI to help instantaneously sort out the weapons mix that should be used to take out the drones, because you want to use the least expensive system possible to take out things that are coming in, so that you're not being overwhelmed economically just by the sheer number of low-cost drones.
And is this idea getting much traction?
Well, I've talked about it a lot. We published it in The Economist, Nico Lange and I, a German defense expert. I've talked about it. Polish foreign ministry and foreign minister and defense ministers. I've talked about it also with a few NATO allies. It's the typical breakdown in NATO. The North and the East are saying, yes, we need to do this. And the Western allies tend to be a bit more cautious. And so far, what Rutte has done is find that sweet spot in the middle ground and articulate it very forcefully, which he has done quite well. But I think that we are seeing Russia behave in deliberately aggressive ways toward NATO. And it's important that he see that NATO has the capability and the will to defend itself. If he sees weakness when he probes, he'll probe deeper the next time.
It's being reported this week that the US will provide intelligence to Ukraine to target enemy infrastructure inside Russia, and that other NATO allies should follow suit. Is this big news? It has actually been pointed out to me by one analyst that maybe this is already happening.
Yeah. So this is a great question, because it is already happening. Ukraine has been striking targets deep inside Russia for months now. And they've been having a significant impact on logistics in Russia, on oil refineries, gasoline supplies, trains that are delivering weapons to the front line. They've been doing quite well. And the only thing is that most of what Ukraine had done up until this point had been with Ukraine's own weapons. And here the US is now saying, and other allies have long said, there shouldn't be any restriction on Ukrainians of not using the weapons that we're providing to defend themselves by going after targets deep inside Russia. It is part of they're hitting military targets, not civilian targets, or at least militarily relevant for the logistics and supply chains, which are needed to send all of that fuel and ammunition and equipment and so forth to the front lines. So that is what may be changing, is a more relaxed attitude from the West about Ukraine using Western systems to do that.
But about the intelligence sharing specifically, that was already going on as well.
Yeah, and this is what I wanted to comment on. We shouldn't be talking about that. And it's frustrating. It was frustrating during the Biden administration when we would publicly announce everything that we won't do. And then we would do a weapons delivery package and we'd announce everything that was in it. And now we're we're here in the Trump administration, and we're announcing that we're doing intelligence sharing for long range targeting inside Russia. We don't need to be talking about this. And you are right that just as a practical matter, when you have intelligence and you have intelligence is data. It's a data picture. It's information about what's there. This is stuff that, yes, the Western countries have and share. It's also stuff that Ukraine itself already has, and you work together and you have a comprehensive picture of what's there. So it is not as dramatic as the news articles make it sound, and in fact has already been in existence. Ukraine knows pretty well what it's hitting.
So, what should we be talking about? Should we be talking about what more could be provided in terms of long range weapons? Because there's a talk about the Tomahawk missiles, but there's also some kind of talk about how useful it might be anyway and whether Ukraine could launch it effectively if it were to be given it anyway.
We have to stop talking down the Ukrainians and suggesting that somehow we know better than they do. Um, every step of the way for the last 3.5 years, the West has had dismissive expectations of Ukraine, and Ukraine has outperformed by far. And if you were sitting in your home in London right now and you had to choose between British air defense and Ukrainian air defense, I think you would choose Ukrainian air defense at the moment because there isn't much in Britain. So I think that we have to stop talking down the Ukrainians. Now, that being said, I do think that we shouldn't have limits. This is a war where Russia is seeking to eliminate the independence, the sovereignty of Ukraine, and the identity of Ukrainian people. So they need to fight and defend themselves. And if we're giving them aid to do so, or we're providing weapons and ammunition and so forth and intelligence, don't put limits on it. Let them defend themselves. Don't say, okay, well, you can hit that, but you can't hit that. That doesn't make much sense to me. So we should stop doing that. In addition to the rest of your question, what more should we be doing? We should let people buy and provide weapons to Ukraine that the Ukrainians need. We should apply secondary sanctions to Russia's oil and gas exports. So right now we have sanctions that the West applies on those things. And so everything is sanctioned, the vessels, the fuel itself. But others who do not participate in that sanctions regime are buying Russian oil and gas, processing it, and reselling it on global markets. India is doing that. China is doing that. So we should be going after those businesses that are doing exactly that. The vessels, the ports, the insurance companies, the refineries, the banks, anyone who is engaged in that business should be subject to sanctions as well, because it'll cut off their access to international financial systems, and that in turn will have a direct impact on their ability to pay Russia for this. What President Trump has talked about is tariffs on a whole country, like India. Say, okay, if you keep trading with Russia, then we'll put tariffs on the country. That to me is not a good approach. First off, there's no guarantee the Indians or the Chinese would comply with the U.S. demand. Secondly, it targets a whole country rather than those who are engaged in this particular trade. And in the case of China, it could result in retaliatory tariffs that would be more damaging to the U.S. than if we just targeted the companies that are engaged in that trade. And I think we could actually get some understanding from China that it's a limited and targeted approach. So those are the couple of things that I would do. And then finally, we have stopped in the last month talking about a ceasefire. And I think that that's a shame. It was actually Vladimir Putin's suggestion to stop talking about a ceasefire and say, oh, he wants to do a full peace deal. Well, we know he doesn't want to do a full peace deal. He wants a Ukrainian surrender. And so I think realistically, we have to get back to the idea of just stop the fighting where we are, stop the war, and stabilize it. And then we can move on to rebuilding Ukraine, strengthening Ukraine's sovereignty and independence and military capabilities and so forth. That would be the thing that I think we should be pushing on again to get Putin to actually stop these nightly raids and stop the attacks on the battlefield.
And is it what you just outlined, the pressure that you talked about? Is that how you bring about the talk of a ceasefire again? Because at the moment, no matter what happens, there has been no real leverage really on President Putin to come and negotiate, has there? And he's just literally not done it and not done anything, regardless of any deadline that's lapsed.
Yes, that is exactly right. Uh, that it's the economic lever in particular. He doesn't care how many troops he loses on the battlefield, and he just keeps wanting to throw them forward to the front line. But as we saw in the news in the last 2 days, Russia is already having to start to make choices. Does it spend money on the military, or does it have to spend some of that money domestically now because of social and economic situation in the country? And they announced that they are going to have a decrease in the amount of money going to the military next year. Not a huge decrease, still 8% of GDP, which is enormous, but it's going to be lower than it was in 25. That is interesting because, first off, the fact that they have to make a choice like that shows that they are under strain. And secondly, the fact that they would say that they are making a choice like that means they are responding to some sort of expectation or pressure inside the country that this is now too much. And so they need to rebalance that. Interesting that they feel that and feel a need to say that. And that's what we should be piling onto with secondary sanctions and with the frozen assets and with the military support, including long range. All of that should be aimed at pushing Russia further in that direction to get them to decide to end the war.
And just to expand on you saying that we should be talking about a ceasefire and we're not doing so anymore, should we also perhaps be still talking or start talking again that Ukraine can still win the war? Because if you look at what was said by the former CIA director and the four-star general David Petraeus, he laid out those 3 points, which I think you've largely covered anyway, for Ukraine being able to do that. You know, the powerful drones, security guarantees, sanctions tightened against Russia by the EU and Trump. I mean, how far off, when you take stock of where we are at the moment, are we from those 3 things happening effectively together?
Well, look, I think that Dave Petraeus and President Trump, I think they're right that Ukraine can win the war. It would require a lot of money and military support and fighting and loss of life on Ukraine's side as well. And it's a choice. The Ukrainians may say, we want to fight no matter what. And it's conceivable, it's quite possible that they could win. They could take the territory back. But I think Ukrainians themselves are feeling that this war has had an enormous toll on the country. They look at Donbass now and say it is largely destroyed. These cities that were there are barely functioning. They're having to bring in water from Russia to Donbass because there's a water shortage now. So I think that the Ukrainians are both exhausted and would like to have an end to the fighting. And I think they're also understanding that just saying we're going to get the territory back when the population has left and it is fully destroyed is not as important perhaps as the lives that you save now. That's a Ukrainian choice to make. It's not for us to tell them what to do. But I think that pushing them to keep fighting and take all the territory back would probably be just as bad as saying that, no, we don't want you to. It's really a tough call. You can fight and you can try to win, or you could say, let's have a ceasefire.
In Poland this week, President Zelensky said, if you can stop Russia's aerial attacks, you'll stop the war. It won't be able to continue the war. Is he right?
I think so. I think we are seeing, and this is where we started, we're seeing evidence that Russia is in a much weaker position. Putin is in a weaker position than he wants to admit. That's why he is showing these purportedly strong, provocative acts against NATO to get us to respond to that. And the economic indicators are very bad for Putin right now. So, yes, I think that they are getting to that point, and we need to keep pushing.
There's been a lot of excitement about Donald Trump's post on Truth Social after that meeting with President Zelensky on the sidelines of the UN Assembly last week. A week on, with a week's hindsight, has anything changed?
I would say maybe just a little bit. When he did that, it was an expression of frustration with Putin, deliberately trolling him by saying, "Oh, your military is terrible. You should have won this in a week, and now you're still stuck after 3 years. Your economy is in terrible shape. It's not a good look for Russia. Ukraine can take all the territory back, maybe even more." It was really just trying to get under Putin's skin, and it did not indicate any commitment to U.S. action. And indeed, the end of that post was more like Trump waving across the Atlantic saying, "Okay, Europe and Ukraine, good luck." And in the week that's transpired since then, we've seen a little bit more granularity of talking, for instance, about sharing intelligence on targeting long range. We've seen discussions about, well, what about Tomahawks? What about Barracudas? We've seen a reinforcement that maybe there is some follow through to that, which is interesting because I think maybe that is intentional on the part of the Trump administration because they didn't get a reaction from Putin. They want Putin to end the war. They want Putin to make a deal. And the more he doesn't move and the more he doesn't engage, then I think they're just trying to let this pressure roll up a little bit.
So is your interpretation then that Donald Trump is not walking away? Because that has been some of the analysis, that the good luck and the fact that that the US will continue to supply weapons to NATO for NATO so they can do what they want to do with them. All of that is kind of only going to be borne out by what actually happens, and they're just words, and it might not really matter.
I think, it even came up in one of President Trump's press conferences last week at the UN. He views the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan as an embarrassment and a catastrophe. And he would view a walking away from Ukraine and allowing Ukraine to lose in the same way. That this is not what he wants his legacy to be, as having been defeated, having looked weak. That is one of the things he detests the most, is any appearance of weakness. So he is going to stay engaged. Now, what he really wants is the deal. He wants Russia to stop the war and reach a deal of some kind so that he can have the Nobel Peace Prize, he can lift sanctions, they can go back to making money. So this is what he really wants. And Putin is not giving him that. And so he is having to stay in and then keep escalating slowly, but he is escalating now to try to get that response from Putin.
But at the same time, distancing himself from taking the responsibility by perhaps positioning Europe to take up the slack.
Well, yes and no. One of the things that has been very consistent about President Trump is seeking to rebalance the transatlantic security relationship. He has always felt the U.S. has spent too much and done too much, and Europe was free riding, building social systems and paying for Russian oil and gas while we were subsidizing defense. So he has tried to turn that upside down. And that's why he's pushed NATO to spend 5% of GDP on defense. It's why he's insisting that Europeans buy weapons and ammunition and give it to Ukraine, not U.S. taxpayers. So he is trying to rebalance that. That doesn't mean walking away. That means that the things that the U.S. has that are unique and valuable are still U.S. contributions that we can make. But he doesn't want to be doing so much and doing it first that Europe just sits back and coasts. He wants the Europeans to take a lead.
So just to return to where we started in the earlier part of our conversation, you were recently in Ukraine. Just interested to know what your takeaway was from this visit.
Well, this most recent visit, and I think I counted up while I was there, it was either 14 or 15 visits since February 22. On this most recent one, what I was struck by is the Ukrainians are moving on. In other words, they are resolving that we don't know if or when this war is going to end. We have to learn to live with a state of war and keep moving and keep building the country. No one was using the phrase after the war then we'll do X, Y, or Z. People are just doing things. They're building a Hilton hotel in Odessa, and I met the guy, the businessman who's doing that. They are repairing things. They are building a more modern energy grid. They just put in electronic battery storage for the electricity system outside of Kyiv to provide a stable load, so you don't have the kind of blackouts that we had in Spain this summer from renewables. They are doing distributed energy production. So as these big Soviet era thermal power plants and other things will come offline over time, they're being replaced by energy production that is going to be more modern and more dispersed and therefore more resilient. So they are moving on mentally. Now, of course, they all hope that the war ends. And they hope that Trump is successful in, getting a peace deal, but they're not putting much stock in that. They're not waiting for that.
So, did you come away feeling optimistic, or?
Well, I'm always a bit optimistic. I was optimistic right when President Trump took office. Day one, he put out this tweet talking about the Russian economy, and it may have to impose, tough tariffs and sanctions if Russia doesn't stop the war. And my optimism is rooted in that you can always count on Putin to be Putin. As much as people would like things to be different and, just have some peace deal, force Ukraine to concede territory, etc., Putin is driven not by what you or I would be driven by. He's driven by these dreams of rebuilding the Russian Empire, seeing himself in the pantheon alongside Catherine the Great and Peter the Great. And everything that was once Russian land should again be Russian land. And that Ukrainians are not a separate people. They're confused Russians. And so he is always going to go to the extreme. And that means that he will fail, because you're not going to end Ukraine as a country. You're not going to eliminate Ukrainian as a national identity. You're not going to take the Ukrainianness out of Ukrainians. So Putin is not going to win at this. And it will, by being excessive, so maximalist in his demands, he will force the Ukrainians to fight, and he will force the West to support Ukraine. And so even when people were worried that, Trump's going to sell them out, I didn't see that. I think we're much more likely to get into the scenario that we are approaching now, where Russia is feeling a need for a ceasefire because it is having problems economically and militarily that it won't be able to sustain indefinitely.
Kurt Volker, great to speak to you. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you.
You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot. If you'd like to be the first to get exclusive content, you can sign up for membership with the link below. You can also listen to Times Radio for the latest news or read it on thetimes.com.